Hey everyone, this is Hindsight of episode 7 with Sean Carroll, which was Religion at the Hospital. I am outside enjoying the last days of summer, I guess, here in the Northeast. I'm at Trexler Park in Allentown, Pennsylvania, for anyone who wants to know. It's where I grew up. Okay, first off, I want to make a little announcement of something that's really, really awesome. I am part of a team that's putting together an event in New York City with Sasha Sagan. She, that Sagan, she is the daughter of Carl Sagan and Anne Druin, and wrote this incredible book, which I've had the privilege of reading an advance copy of. And it comes out October 22nd. It's called For Small Creatures Such as We. And it's an incredible book full of essays all about the need to develop and understand rituals and rites of passage and tradition from a purely secular lens. There's a lot of amazing sort of stuff about her father growing up in there, who's a hero of mine and I hope many of yours. And it's a perfect segue. Anyway, that event with Sasha Sagan, we'll put a link to it, is November 17th in New York City at a place called the Players Theater, which is a nice little theater in the West Village, and it's going to be an incredible night. We're going to invite anyone who comes to share their traditions and rituals and rites of passage and little silly things or big things that you have questions about or that you've developed in your own families or had growing up and stuff. It's going to be an incredible, hopefully meaningful night. Sasha's an incredible person. I think that particular conversation is one that is incredibly important. And it came up a lot in the last episode with Sean Carroll. So come to that event. If you're in New York City or if you're anywhere close, come in for it. Sasha's incredible. Come. So in that conversation with Sean, we did mention Sasha's father, Carl, or I mentioned it in that long is-ought debate and my attempt to build the bridge from is to ought using an observation from Carl Sagan. I hope you heard Sean's therapy on me, and I've been slowly sort of accepting it that I agree logically you cannot derive an ought from an is, but it's not a bad pitch for it, I guess, with Carl Sagan. I did also want to, one thing that was funny in that episode is that we sort of kept glossing over this notion about God not existing, and that being this thing that you can answer or know. I think maybe a better way to put it is that God is a poor explanation for the universe in which we find ourselves. I wanted to talk a little bit more about it and share a little bit of an experience I had talking to a Mennonite pastor down at Ground Zero on 9/11 when I was down there, and a wonderful conversation that we got into that I think went to some pretty interesting places and dovetailed very well with the conversation about Sean and naturalism. We mentioned naturalism, Sean and I. That I will I'll say was the first ever theory or philosophy that I ever found on my own as a teenager based purely on how well it was named, naturalism. I remember as a teenager asking a lot of questions about God and it not sitting well with me as an explanation for the universe that I was in. There was questions that I kind of was discouraged from asking very openly. I felt that was just because the people I was asking really didn't have the answers. I grew up in a very secular Jewish environment, but even in that environment, there was unsatisfying conversations. And naturalism was this view of a commitment to denying or rejecting, or even let's just call it ignoring, the possibility that there is anything supernatural. And so we're stuck, but I would say not stuck. We're embracing the notion that everything has an explanation in the natural world. Let me give you a sort of a concrete example of that came up with this pastor, this Mennonite pastor. We got into a lot of deep conversations, and eventually it got to some point where I was trying to sort of explain to him my view of approaching these kinds of questions. And I think I was holding a pencil or something at the time, but I have a leaf here in my hand for all those listening. By the way, if you're listening to this, go find the YouTube video because it's a beautiful day, and here I am sitting in the in the grass. I'm holding a leaf in my hand. And if I drop this leaf right now, let's pretend I was in a vacuum and there was no wind and air pressure and atmosphere moving around. If I dropped it in a vacuum right now, it would fall towards the center of the earth at 9.8 meters per second, or even some more precise sort of measurement that I could take. The naturalist view would say, and I told this pastor, I was like, if I drop it, it will probably do that. It will probably take that action. And the probability of that is incredibly, incredibly high, obviously. This would sort of be the scientific view. But in science, you almost have to put the word probably before everything, because if I drop it, and it doesn't this time, so I'm going to drop it right now. Look, it did it again. It dropped towards the earth. But if it hadn't, the commitment to naturalism would lead you to say, that's funny. I wonder what the explanation for it would be. And so you don't jump to the supernatural, where I think a religious philosophy would say, if it didn't drop to the middle, you would say that's a miracle, and all sort of explanation is done. It's a miracle and God did it. Well, that's not good enough for the naturalistic point of view. Miracles, in that view, are just mysteries that we do not yet have the explanation for. So there's a famous old way to put this, in summary of putting this, that people tend to think that the word eureka is where science starts, right? Like you're doing an experiment and it's like, eureka, I found it. But actually, the phrase where science starts and the naturalistic sort of enterprise starts is the phrase, that's funny. So that's what I would do. If I drop this and 1 million times in a row it drops towards the earth at 9.8 meters per second, but this time it doesn't, my phrase would be, that's funny. And that's where the questions begin. This is the view, I think, in many ways, when you sort of embrace that view and that commitment. And I was able to have this conversation with this pastor. In many ways, I would say, like, that is actually a commitment towards looking for God. If you say God is sort of the cause in some mysterious way of this not falling towards earth, I'm looking for the explanation. And I find it a bit pessimistic and perhaps lazy to just jump to the conclusion without looking for it of God did it. I found the answer. It's like, okay, well, why not look for it? Why not search for God, small g God in that case? That's the conversation I got into deeply with this pastor. And I think it actually clarifies some of the fundamental differences between the atheistic enterprise, which I find incredibly optimistic, and the religious enterprise, which I find a bit pessimistic, that we have the ability to discover answers to things that appear to be miracles. I bring all that up because, of course, in this case, we were dealing with Betsy, who would be committed to the God explanation and God hypothesis. And the question for me really revolved around whether we have a duty to investigate our beliefs, because if we don't, they will inevitably lead to moral failings when they are imposed upon others or they affect your actions upon others, which I think Sean actually agreed with, although we both certainly understood that Betsy, the nurse, given the priors that she had and the conclusions that she had in her mind, was acting in her framework as morally as she could be, and I think we can all sort of sympathize with that. So in some ways, this all really, really dovetails again with Sasha's event and that crucial conversation that Sean is also involved in with he mentioned this conference he put together called Moving Naturalism Forward, which was several years ago, was on this conversation of like, okay, God is a bad explanation. Now what? What do we do? How do we build morality? How do we construct these kind of things? That leads me to the second thing that I want to circle back on in the conversation, which was a mention about utilitarianism. And him sort of, I think his exact line in the conversation was, the deeper that he gets into moral philosophy and reads it, the less attracted he is to utilitarianism. I completely share that view. And I have an article coming out. I just submitted it to a few places, so hopefully within the next week or so it's published, and I'll push it out on Twitter and all those places, where I simply call it Utilitarianism is not a moral philosophy. And the real simple view of that argument is that utilitarianism, in simple terms, is, let's call it a commitment, an attempt to maximize flourishing and minimize suffering. You could picture, and I do this in the article, but you could picture, a simple scale of put suffering on this side and flourishing on this side, and make decisions that have the fulcrum cause the tilt to be, weighted more towards the flourishing side, and that's how you should guide your life. Maybe you're already seeing, like, this is a great exercise and a great, let's call it, in the article I call it a brainstorming activity for how to sort of, move through the world. I call it a glorified pros and cons list, which is something that I think we've all done or tried to do, of like, oh, you're stuck with a situation, make a list of pros and of cons. The problem is, it just kicks the real deeper questions of moral philosophy deeper into the shadows of course, what is suffering and what is flourishing? And how do we define those things? And how do we place variables on either side of that? And how do we weight them? Consequentialism sort of is a cousin of utilitarianism, which just has a little bit more of a commitment or emphasis on the probability of the outcomes of things, which is getting quite interesting with AI simulations and whatnot that might be able to better predict future outcomes of different decisions. But my general case is that this is maybe the last step in a process of making moral decisions, where you have already constructed your framework of what is suffering and what is flourishing, and then you could slot certain things into the flourishing side and certain things into the suffering side and weight them however you're going to do, and then make your decision. And I think that's fine. But someone who calls themselves a utilitarian, I think I know very little about them, because I need to know much, much more about the frameworks of how they approach what is flourishing and what is suffering. This, I think, leads to something more like virtue ethics, which if you harken back way to our first episode of Susan Wolf, I think she was making this case really well of a plurality of viewpoints for these things, and that a commitment to one sort of moral philosophy framework is usually fool's gold, and especially utilitarianism, I think, gets you not very far. And I worry that a lot of people have assumed that it is a complete kind of moral framework and moral philosophy that you can carry with you and use as a guide for the world. It actually is not much. Like I said, it's a good brainstorming session. And then there's some situations in some cases which are so obvious to what is flourishing and what is suffering that it is a good guide. In the article, I bring up a question of, should we really desire to get rid of malaria? The answer is yes. And so movements like effective altruism, which is sort of a utilitarian movement, take questions like that maybe it's obvious what flourishing and suffering is in that case, and try to come up with a lot of metrics of how you could best affect actualized outcomes to your desired moral guidelines in that case. But I agree with Sean that utilitarianism is overused and overrated as far as a moral philosophy. You have to start earlier than that with the bigger, deeper questions. What is a virtuous life? To get a little political, in fact, I put this on Twitter. I don't know how many times we've mentioned Trump on the podcast yet. I don't like mentioning him. I'm not a fan of Trump, but I've been on the fence about impeachment. And this last week, with this Ukraine stuff happening, and maybe his administration, if the whistleblower complaint has weight behind it, I've moved towards the argument that a utilitarian can make an argument that if you move forward with impeachment here, it will strengthen his base. He will win again. This is going to revitalize the Trump phenomenon, which maybe was showing signs of withering, and he'll win again, and that will lead to all these harms. That would sort of be a utilitarian math, right? Like, put the harms on that side if that's the direction you're going to go. and then you sort of use that as your guide to make a decision there. Again, there's some merit to it, but I think at some point, that argument is always available. It's always available that you can put enough sort of harms or flourishing on probable outcomes that you could justify just about anything using a utilitarian sort of math equation. Where I'm much more attracted to something like virtue ethics, and this particular moment of the Trump phenomenon, and if this whistleblower complaint has weight behind it, I think it's much more admirable and honorable, and laudable, whatever words you want to sort of use there, to describe or define a kind of virtue that you ought to live by or uphold, in this case something about the sanctity of open democracy and of error correction in political systems, that this is such a violation of, that you ought to uphold that virtue, and sort of that overrides the utilitarian probability math that might even lead to more quote-unquote harm if you consider the Trump administration harmful and a re-election to be harmful. You can understand sort of the balance there, but I think the virtue ethics, because how do you weight it? If you say, well, okay, the Trump presidency and another one is so much harm and so harmful that it's going to outweigh anything on the other side, what kind of weight would you really put on something like abandoning the virtue of what I just explained or what I just said? How will you look at yourself in the mirror and go to your grave with your head held high, knowing that this is sort of the way you operated? How you weight that, how you put weight on that. What if I just put an incredible, near infinite amount of weight to the harm that causes, even internally, that I just override any kind of harm you put on the other side of the scale? So maybe you already see there that just calculating harms and defining harms narrowly is already you need a framework to do that. You need a metric to do that. Utilitarianism doesn't help you at all in that case. It's just the final analogy to maybe help guide some decisions there. So anyway, this entire kind of conversation and kind of thinking about morality and about ethics, he borrows from Sharon Street, as he said, at NYU, with this moral constructivism philosophy or framework of talking about these things. I'm quite attracted to it as well. I hope more people who get deeper into philosophy might start to see the same kind of thing, that utilitarianism is attractive because it seems to answer questions and solve questions and has this kind of very familiar formula of a pro and con, list on your notebook and then you're done. But it's not so damn simple. It's sort of the argument that I wanted to remind people of. So this article that I have coming out, I think is good. It talks about my experience with a high school ethics bowl, where this kind of conversation that I just walked through, high schoolers are very attracted to utilitarianism, maybe for obvious reasons, that we've conditioned them to really want right and wrong answers, which in a lot of the subjects that they take in school, there maybe are right or wrong answers and sort of a quantified grade that they get at the end of the class. But moral philosophy doesn't quite work that way. But utilitarianism is this attractive lure that I think has ensnared a few too many really talented thinkers, and it's not as potent as people have come to think. So that's it. This was and again, it was apologize for the technical problems and that Coleman wasn't on the last episode. He's on the next one. He's on all the other ones. He also has his own podcast coming out very soon, so look for that, his solo podcast, which is going to be sort of general conversations with Coleman that are going to be super fun. So next episode is with Rebecca Goldstein, such a phenomenal thinker. It's about this conversation that I mentioned in the last one. It's about death again. This one in particular about a person who builds an AI chatbot using the data from a friend of hers who died very tragically, and the ethics of grief and immortality, reincarnation, really, really, really big things. It's a pretty serious and heavy one. Coleman and I both lost a parent far before their time. Me 3 years ago with my dad, and him I think it was 5 years ago with his mom. So we get into also a little bit of our personal experience with grief. So it's sort of a heavy episode. And there you go. So I will remind you again, all of these conversations are really swimming around the conversation that Sasha Sagan is pushing upon all of us. I hope people engage with that book. It's a phenomenally good book. It's a short read. You'll read it in a week, or a weekend. I mean, it's just a couple days. She's a beautiful writer. She's very much her father's daughter, incredible writer and wordsmith. And the event is going to be great. So